So I have just about finished a 2-week solo stretch on the Continental Divide Trail. I'm just about at Chief Joseph Pass over there. You can hear a little bit of traffic because of the road going through there. It's been a great 2 weeks and spectacular scenery, a lot of wildlife, including marten, bear, elk, pronghorn, fox, coyote. But I'm about as hungry as I have been in years. I ran out of, basically was down to half rations 4 days ago and have not eaten now in about 30 hours and feeling a little weak with hunger, but otherwise great. It's been a really fun couple weeks, though I'm looking forward to seeing some friends on the trail for the next stretch. My name is John Davis, and I was the youngest of the co-founders of what has grown into a force for rewilding North America. I've been an advocate for wildlife and wild places my entire life, and in the early 1990s co-founded the Wildlands Network with passionate scientists and activists. From the beginning, our goal has been to create wildlife corridors that span the continent and allow wildlife to move throughout natural ecosystems, safe from human threats. Over the last 25 years, we have brought together conservation leaders to protect land through sound science, education, and legislation, always sharing a big vision of continental rewilding. After years of advocating, I needed to experience the wildlands more expansively for myself. I wanted to better understand how and where human decisions affect the movement of wildlife, connect with other conservation leaders in the most critical places, and find ways to reconnect ourselves with wild nature. Connections aren't just about place to place or animals to place, but also about people to place. So, in 2011, I trekked from Florida to Gass Bay, the Eastern Wildway. Then, in 2013, I trekked the spine of the continent, the Western Wildway. Trek West follows the Western Wildway, a proposed continental-scale conservation and recreation corridor mapped by Wildlands Network and partners that would allow wolves and cougars and other wide-ranging species to move through the landscape and would allow species to shift their ranges to adapt to changing climates. As I began my 5,000-mile trek, I checked in with my mentor and fellow Wildlands Network co-founder Dave Foreman, who literally wrote the book on rewilding North America. Dave, as you know, I am in large part on Trek West trying to ground truth what you proposed in rewilding North America, and I, of course, did so 2 years ago with Trek East, and thankfully I'm confirming what you suggest and propose and outline.
One of the first steps in actually protecting a continental wildway is to get to know it, and not just know the individual pieces of it, but to know the whole thing as a whole. In essence, to be a human like you are, pretending to be a big cat or a wolf, figuring out what route to take, and seeing that on the ground. And by doing it all in one fell swoop, like you're doing, you get the overview. And so that really is the first step. What we need to do is do it piecemeal with lots of different organizations working on their own areas, working on individual barriers, but also finding the ways we would connect national parks and wilderness areas to one another for wildlife movement, and then working through whatever means are possible, whether through national monument designation by the president, by protecting the roadless areas that are between those areas, by working with private landowners who may have small parts of those, and trying to get conservation-oriented folks to get those lands. The whole works, trying to protect endangered species, trying to deal with the unknowables of climate change. The whole wildway concept, I think, is our best thing to do on the ground with that. Through Wildlands Network and other conservation groups, Dave and I have worked together for decades trying to realize this vision, and he gave me the inspiration I needed to start my journey.
The little town of Sahuaripa, Sonora, Mexico was my starting point. It is also the gateway to the globally important Northern Jaguar Reserve. Local students and teachers gave my friends from the Northern Jaguar Project and Naturalia a hero's welcome. These Sonoran students proudly celebrate their wild neighbor, the jaguar, the most powerful cat in the Western Hemisphere, now eliminated from most of the northern part of its original range, the southwest U.S. and northern Mexico. The warm winter sun guided our riding and hiking by day. Clear skies frosted our sleeping bags by night. For many days in the reserve and beyond, we traversed desert washes, forests, and thorn scrub. Because jaguars are elusive creatures, our guide Daniela had set up remote cameras to try to get glimpses of the jaguars in this area. Daniela, you can't tell what images are on there until you plug it into a computer.
She's Cecilia, is the name of the mom, and he's Cheto, the cop.
After 100 or so beautiful desert miles, we reached Mexico's greatest mountain range, the Sierra Madre. The most difficult barrier for jaguars trying to reclaim ancestral home ranges in the southwestern United States is one brought about by politics, the border wall. I arrived at the wall with a group of concerned citizens to raise our voices about wildlife's need for safe passages. Thank you for being part of this action today here. I think we're making a peaceful statement that this wall does not belong here. This area should be open for wildlife movement. This border wall is an obstacle to wildlife movement. Put simply, the wall blocks wildlife and fragments habitat. Though the fight is against immense political power, there are still some safe passages and a growing movement of people wanting to see the wall taken down. Among the most charismatic and articulate of the many conservation leaders I met on Trek West was wildlands philanthropist Valère Austin. Valère and her organization Cuenca Los Ojos have purchased and protected tens of thousands of acres in the Sky Islands of southern Arizona and northern Sonora. Valère is deeply concerned about the border wall as it fragments habitat she is working to protect.
The refuge here has primarily been set up to help, as Valère said, restore and create sustainability for the fish that are in this basin and the river. And in order to do that, even though there's a border and a boundary, the fish, that means nothing to them. So we have to work cooperatively with the landowners around us.
All this vegetation came in after we put these gabions in. And 15 years ago, cars used to drive up this wash to the United States with contraband, and now they can't drive up anymore. So within the last 10 years, we've gotten the river to flow year-round and are bringing fish back into the system.
For the first 1,000 or so miles of my journey, I was in Lobo country. If you're extremely lucky when in the backcountry of the Sky Islands or Gila Wildlands complex, you'll hear the evocative howls of the Mexican wolf, a rare keystone species found now only in a few recovery areas of New Mexico, Arizona, and Sonora, after bold efforts to save the species from extinction through reintroduction measures. We knew this primal voice needed assistance from its supporters, so we raised our voices to energize a growing collaborative effort of conservationists and concerned citizens. Our goal was to inject sound science into the Mexican wolf recovery program and protect the wild connections the wolves need to survive. Moving through the wolves' landscape, I notice these ecosystems are again fragmented, not just by walls, but also by highways. Roads block wildlife movement, creating deadly barriers for animals trying to reach feeding or breeding grounds or new territories. That problem grows as human populations expand. Fortunately, this is a solvable problem. Many, even within government, are fighting for wildlife crossings that keep people safe and our wildlife truly wild.
This is passage rate when the animals come to these underpasses and the percentage that go through versus the ones that leave. And when they cross at grade, try to cross on the highway, the higher the traffic volume, the lower the passage rate. So basically, once the volume gets up in here, it's a total barrier to them. So the question is, well, how are we ever going to get these highways to where they're permeable?
Yeah.
And the key is underpasses. Yep. So they work. Yeah. And this is why they work, and that's what's kind of cool about it is to be able to show and say that not only do they work on low volume highways, but they work on the really, really high volume ones. And that's the challenge.
There are many ways to define it, but however you do, the Colorado Plateau is one of the most beautiful landscapes on Earth. Its southwestern end, the iconic Grand Canyon, is a crown jewel in our national park system, but it is not yet complete. Much of the Grand Canyon's north rim is outside the national park. I was lucky to share this leg of my trip with some of the park's greatest protectors.
More clearing on that side over there because the blade will go into the dirt. Yeah. The giant hairy scorpion, Hedera sculpturatus, and it's our biggest scorpion in the U.S. Not very poisonous, but really formidable, almost edible size.
Well, here we are on the North Kaibab Forest, one of the most ecologically significant portions of the proposed national monument. This is the last big chunk of old-growth ponderosa left in the southwest that doesn't have the protection to assure that it would continue. Old-growth forests are critical for a number of reasons. One is that they comprise some of the most resilient environments. Things that can rebound from fires, can rebound from drought, and given the issue of climate change, the crisis that we're enduring now, this sky island of ponderosa and mixed conifer, as the Kaibab is surrounded by desert and becomes very critical to protect and maintain the species that are found here that are unique here.
I spent most evenings during my trek studying maps of the mountains and rivers ahead and sleeping in my tarp tent, or when I could, directly under the stars. Though I felt prepared for this trip, what I saw in southern Utah shocked me. Oil and gas development littered an area proposed for Greater Canyonlands National Monument, part of which later became Bears Ears National Monument. Sprawling energy development has become a dangerous, fragmenting force across much of the West. The resulting infrastructure shatters habitats into smaller, less viable pieces. But that wasn't all. Logging, livestock grazing, man-made dams, and introduction of exotic fish species were damaging the rivers. In fact, many of the streams I crossed and drank from were inhabited by non-native fish, literally changing the contents of the river. My hopes were renewed, thankfully, by our Escalante watershed partners who showed me some of their fish restoration efforts and introduced me to the rare native cutthroat trout. This is an endangered species they're working to restore. Again and again I heard a form of this message. Conservation is often about undoing the harmful damage of past decisions. It was inspiring to realize how far we have come in understanding natural ecosystems, but it was sobering to think about how much work remains. Wildlands friends and I took to the Green River and formed a floating summit, strategizing how we could realize the Western Wildway concept along the spine of the continent.
Oh, can we do it rapid?
Just remember that you might miss lunch.
It's just for that single animal.
Leading the discussion was Dr. Michael Soule, a fellow Wildlands Network co-founder and the father of conservation biology.
Main point is that we can't sell connectivity with wolves alone. It's nice to have wolves and grizzly bears and migratory birds, but what will sell is the human interest and the human adventure, and I think more. So if we can focus on freedom of people to roam. So our idea of corridors is not just corridors for wildlife, it's corridors for people to move up and down the spine. There's trails, expanded network of trails, and get the schools involved, outdoor education, get the children out from the cities in the summer, out into the mountains.
After an inspiring few weeks in Utah's canyon country, I sat down with Sierra Club's executive director, Michael Brune.
Our Wild America for the Sierra Club really is all about connecting people to nature and then establishing larger connected areas of nature. And it starts actually in maybe the opposite of what you're visiting. So it starts with our program called Nearby Nature, which is for people who live in urban areas or suburban areas who don't have access to any wild areas in their backyards, trying to find those bridges between where you might live in suburban America or in our cities into nature. And then the program largely is about establishing large interconnected areas across the Intermountain West, across most of the West, and also back on the East as well. And so I think that there's plenty of ways in which we can get involved, which is both to illustrate and advocate for the protection of some of our most important places in the country. Well, first, there's a lot that the Sierra Club can get from a deeper partnership with Wildlands, in part just because it's your designs that we've used to help inform our campaigns and help inform the meetings that we've had with people on the Hill or in state houses across the country. But the other thing that I would say is that we are much more powerful than you might think as a movement. Because as I travel around the country, and I'm sure you see this too, regardless of where people live, regardless men, women, what they do for a living, regardless of their political backgrounds, people like nature.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
They care about healthy forests, they care about parks and wilderness areas, they're awfully fond of clean air and clean water. And so the question is, how can we unite people around a common vision, and how can we bring people together to do something that is greater than what they might be able to accomplish by themselves?
Back on my bike, it was time to visit some of the innovative ranchers I'd heard about who run sustainable businesses while maintaining the natural health of their lands. My buddy Kenyon Fields and his wife Mary Conover invited me over to their spectacular Mountain Island Ranch in western Colorado and eastern Utah. Throughout the West, I often hear that carnivores and ranching don't go together. I sat down with Mary, whose family has lived here for decades, to find out what she thinks about carnivores moving through her land. Mary, thank you very much for letting me visit you here at Mountain Island Ranch on the south side of Colorado River. Would you tell me a little bit about what you're doing with Mountain Island Ranch?
Well, primarily we raise livestock, of course. Over the years, I've developed an organic program, and we're slowly building an organic herd because the mountain property that we have, the high country, was one of the first conservation easements in Colorado. And now almost the entire ranch is under conservation easement with the Mesa Land Trust. I'd be in favor of reintroducing predators such as the wolf because I think the science shows pretty clearly that the pressures that a predator like the wolf puts on the elk herds creates an entirely different kind of behavior.
Conservation-minded ranchers like Mary are taking bold steps to support wide-ranging animals like wolves, using sound science to bring back natural systems to the West. Mountain Island Ranch showed me what excellent stewardship can look like. From there, I visited my good friend Paul Valdick, who co-owns High Lonesome Ranch, also in Colorado.
I think this landscape, especially here at the High Lonesome Ranch, misses the top-down effects of keystone predators. We've got a lot of black bears, and we've got a lot of cougars that we've learned from our cougar studies here on the ranch. I think we're somewhat out of balance. We've had very little restoration of aspen, as our science studies have shown, since wolves were extirpated from the system. That affects the habitat of songbirds and other wildlife. And so, you know, if I lost a couple mule deer or a couple big bull elk that our hunters might hunt, to me, so what? As Aldo Leopold would say, isn't it much more valuable that I have the health of the whole mountain and not just single species in mind?
I was fortunate to meet with different groups of young people along my trek as well, sharing lessons from the field. By midway through the trek, it was clear that successfully completing protection of a western wildway will depend on this next generation of conservation leaders. So what colleagues and friends and I are doing through the Western Wildway Network and the Wildlands Network is promoting the idea of wildlife corridors at all scales, like a wildlife corridor that might link this with Utah, say, but also a wildlife corridor running the whole length of the Rocky Mountains. And sometimes we call that a Western Wildway or a spine of the continent. A week of solo hiking through the breathtaking Wind River Mountains brought me to the path of the pronghorn. Although the pronghorn hadn't yet started their autumn migration from the Tetons south to the upper Green River Valley, I could see that the habitat connectivity they need is threatened by our roads and fences. Heading north, I moved out of the hot sagebrush and into the cool forests. As I stared up at the towering summit of Grand Teton, I knew my good friend Cindy Toll would be the perfect guide. She was eminently confident navigating the back roads of the Sierra Madre months before, but she was even more at home on this craggy peak. Inevitable exposure above great drops and threats of thunderstorms kept our egos in check. In our few minutes on the summit under darkening skies, we looked down at the wild mountains and plains on one side, contrasting with the endless potato fields looking westward. This mountain range could have easily been a mere ecological island. Luckily, early visionaries connected what we now call Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks, so wildlife still flows throughout the large protected ecosystem. I reached western Montana as August turned to September, again falling upon the graces of those who made my trek possible. We are with the great biologist Lance Craighead of Craighead Institute and his daughter Willow. We are hiking into the Lee Metcalf Wilderness in western Montana, part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Willow? The Craigheads have inspired a generation of conservationists to protect another keystone species in the West, grizzly bears. While bears naturally roam mountains, they also want safe access to the rich grasslands below the mountains, where too often they are shot or trapped. Environments like Paradise Valley, north of Yellowstone Park, are also the playground for biologists Louisa Wilcox and Dave Mattson.
We're only talking about the last pieces, and you've trekked through a lot of them. And what we need is to keep those pieces viable, wild, alive, big enough for bears, and also have a sense of humility so that we're not killing so many that they're no longer extant.
The bottom line is that cougars and grizzly bears don't have any trouble living with us. We have trouble living with them. And that's not an impossible task. We've proven that we can coexist with both of these large carnivores, all the large carnivores actually. So it's fundamentally about how we've organized the world in our heads, and especially our relationship to nature. And large carnivores, more than any other element of nature, is what really challenges us to be different in the world, to be better, more evolved.
Well, one other thing I want to say about what you're doing, John, and that is, just as we're talking about land bridges, bridges between ecosystems, larger ecosystems for species like grizzlies and other carnivores, you're making bridges too. You're making bridges between animals and people, between people's understanding of what these animals can mean and do mean, that they mean more than pictures on a screen, that these are live, interesting individuals. They're quirky just like we are. Some are grumpy, some are fat and happy, some are good moms, some are lousy moms. And there is so many connections that we people need to remake with these animals. So just as you're talking about land bridges, we need to reestablish these bridges with these animals ourselves.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely right. Contemplating the coexistence Louisa and Dave explained so eloquently kept me moving north. We've just seen our first grizzly bears in Glacier National Park, a mother and cub descending a talus slope over there. Very exciting. These great carnivores humble us, but to continue doing so, they need more room to roam. The grizzly bear encapsulates how a Western wildway can happen. It comes down to space and learning to coexist. I met up with Karsten Hoyer, the former director of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, born of our original vision to create large-scale connected landscapes, and Dave Haddon of Montana Headwaters. Midway through the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, formed to protect an important binational ecosystem, I crossed my final border, welcomed by the crisp Canadian air. Karsten and Dave escorted me to the end of my journey, through cold rain and mud that would have otherwise dampened my spirits.
Yes, please.
Reflecting on this journey, I am inspired by the people, places, and animals I met along the way. These friends and places turned a personal quest into a conservation pilgrimage, reigniting my passion to protect our wild neighbors. As my mentor Dave Foreman told me at the beginning of this journey, we must consider the whole picture. If we don't make bold changes swiftly, these beautiful landscapes will lose the spirit that keeps them wild. Even after hiking thousands of miles, biking through deserts and mountains, rafting rocky rivers, my journey to understand this landscape is only beginning. More than ever, it's time to walk the talk.